Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third Lawyer, Poet, and a Philosopher Stay at Home. And our theme tonight is freedom. Very happy that you can join us. I'm very excited to be here once again with our lawyer, Leo Glickman, and our poet, Jane LaCroix. And once we introduce ourselves, we'll get right into our topic for today. And I'll try to do a good job, or a job, of monitoring comments live. So if anyone wants to chime in, hopefully we can bring other people into the conversation. So, Leo, do you want to kick it off by introducing yourself
Sure.
to those who might not know you? Which I think is
Sure.
kind of hard to believe that there's anyone out there.
Does anyone really know me? But my name is Leo Glickman. I am a practicing constitutional lawyer, and that means that I represent clients whose rights have been violated under the Constitution. It also means that I'm not an academic. So, ask me sort of like on a scale of 1 to 10, like up to like 6 on hard questions. Above that, I may not have the expertise, but I'll try. Thanks,
Okay.
Jane.
I'm Jane LaCroix. I'm a poet who fronts two lyrically based bands, Home Slice, that's really psychedelic. And this is stuff I didn't tell you guys before on this show. The Icebergs. I have a new single that came out that's actually like has a lot of stuff about freedom in it, and I'm totally gonna talk about that. It matches perfectly. But I teach poetry to all ages all over the city, adjunct at universities, in elementary schools. And the main place I'm teaching right now is at Uptown Stories, which is a not for profit after school pleasure based writing program that's pay what you can. So I am responsible for having a lot of poems be born in the universe, serving the poetry gods. And yes, I am your poet.
Thank you very much. Very happy for you to be here. My name is Joseph Beal. I'm a philosopher. I run the Gotham Philosophical Society and Young Philosophers of New York, and we try to bring philosophy kind of outside of the academic setting into the lives of New Yorkers and anyone else who's interested. And this is one medium by which to try to do that. And so, looking forward to asking questions about freedom more than uh, f- presenting any particular views of my own. I find it a puzzling topic, so I'm looking for some guidance from the both of you and from our audience. Um, Leo, if there was a question in our previous um, video, our previous get together, and I want to see if I can just try to catch it here. Um, and it was when we were talking about you were talking about liberties, and there was someone who made the comment. Technically, we only you were talking about actually used the term freedoms in our last
Mhm.
week, and he said technically we only have liberties. Freedoms don't really exist in a civil society, and I'm wondering what you what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I that's from my friend Chiyuka, and I wish we had sort of touched base a bit more in between, because I'd be interested to hear more what he has to say about that.
Well,
I,
actually, if
and
you
the
want, because I just see, again, I didn't see this comment until just now, but if you want me to read it, he says,
No, I did see the comment. I saw it.
his
I'm sorry.
response,
Oh no, go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah, because I asked him if he could elaborate on
Okay.
what, and he said, with absolute freedom, where I am free to do whatever I wish, and you are free to do whatever you wish without legal restriction, society becomes anarchy. Do you want me to read that again?
No, I get that totally.
Okay, and then he
Yeah.
continues, of course, there will be consequences for actions, but no legal repercussions. When we agree to a constitutional authority or civil society, we give up freedom in exchange for liberty. Hence, give me liberty or give me death, not give me freedom.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's what we kind of talked about. And I may use the word freedom and liberties interchangeably, and perhaps I'm wrong to do that. I'm not sure, but I might be. But I do. I mean, that's what he's talking about. Chiyuka is really the notion of the social contract, right? Which we really did talk about last week. Just the notion that we're not free in the sense we can't do whatever we want. And I'm going to touch on this a little bit today, although we're going to go in a different direction. Um, but then we're granted liberties within that society that we live in, and the idea, of course, is to kind of retain as much freedom as you can in the context of living in a civil society, in a community, so that we're not hurting each other, essentially. And I think and I think he's right, and he's probably reacting to the fact that I may have used freedom and liberty, and I may do it today, interchangeably. But there is a distinction there, and I think Chiyuka's got it right. So I hope he's listening, because I worked with Chiyuka for a few years, about 20 years ago, and I don't think I ever admitted to him that he did something right. So I hope he's listening tonight.
I certainly hope so. We
So
wouldn't want to miss that.
no, he's a good friend. Yeah, and so we've kind of I've touched on this on sort of aspects of freedom. So I really want to attack it a little bit differently and talk about it, because I think it'd help elucidate the subject further. Talk about it in terms of its opposite, which is, to me, is incarceration. So that's really what I'm going to talk about. But first, I just want to touch a little bit on the concept of freedom. So just to kind of set the table, the Constitution recognizes that humans are endowed with natural rights, which come from some sort of higher authority, whether it's God or something else. But we're endowed with some sort of rights that that the Constitution and the government don't grant us. We're just born with these rights. And so, and the Constitution deals with that interestingly, I think, because there was actually debate about even having a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, and part of that debate was, if we include rights that people have, it sort of suggests that the government is giving them those rights. So if we say the government can't do this or that, it's almost implying that, well, then the government can do certain things to infringe on people's rights. So they included the Ninth Amendment, which was sort of the way the framers dealt with this ultimately, because enough people did want the full Bill of Rights. And basically, I'll just read what it says. It's short. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. So, what that means is that, just because the Constitution says that you have freedom of speech, but it doesn't mention anything about eating kale, it doesn't mean that you don't have a right to eat kale unless the government grants that. Like that's what that's saying. We have rights that belong to us regardless of what the Constitution or the government says. Now, of course, it's, in my view, highly notable that the Constitution proactively excludes people from those natural rights, and obviously, most notably, the African slaves and Native Americans. It didn't just sort of not deal with it. Those people are excluded from what the framers said was a human being's natural rights. So it's, I think, kind of a notable thing that the Constitution, on its own terms, doesn't grant rights. It acknowledges that you have rights. So it really doesn't grant rights, but it actually does proactively exclude people from rights. And although those interpretations and those aspects of it are not enforced today, thankfully, those things still exist in our Constitution. But I still think, nevertheless, to move on from that, the freedom ideal really is in there, and I think it's cherished in our country. But but I think really the way that we can sort of discuss a good way to discuss freedom is to think about how and why we take away freedom from people. I think that tells us also something about freedom and what we think of it. Um, so what we have criminal law. Criminal law is the vehicle by which we can deny a person his natural rights under God, if you will. And I'm going to use the word God every now and then in the most generic term possible. I just mean a higher authority. So we have the criminal law and its punishments for violations of criminal law. And because as a society, we've made value judgments about when behavior is acceptable in a free society and when it's not, we have this body of law. And we punish people. So we punish people for crimes for three reasons. And two of them directly bear on freedom. The first is that we believe that we believe that taking freedom away from a person is considered a terrible punishment for a person, and that most people feel that way. And therefore, the threat of having your freedom taken away is enough to deter people from committing violations of the criminal law, from committing crime. So that's one. And the second is that we believe that certain people who have committed crimes must be incapacitated, which means essentially they need to be restrained. Their freedom needs to be restrained, and they need to be kept in a cage to prevent them from continuing to commit crimes against society. And those are the two that have to do with freedom, I think. And so the third is there's a notion of just desserts, right? That it gives some psychological comfort to a victim of a crime to know that the assailant is being punished. And so those are the three general justifications. So I think that conceptually, denying people of their freedom as punishment is an indication of to the extent to which we appreciate or even cherish our freedom. Because we think that the denial of freedom will stop people from committing crimes against one another. And so that's why we have the criminal law. And in point of fact, most of the criminal law is in fact about people not infringing on each other's rights. So you can't kill somebody. We have laws against homicide, assault, armed robbery, sex crimes. These are all violations of another person's right to be free, right? But there's plenty of criminal laws that don't bear on that at all. Plenty of people go to prison for crimes in which there are no victims. Drug sales, for example, between two freely transacting adults are a violation of criminal law that will put you in prison, that will deny you of your freedom. Same thing with a free transaction of selling sex for money. Same thing. That will land you in jail. Although it's almost always the woman. The man gets a desk appearance ticket and leaves. The woman has to deal with more, but that's still how that works. And yet on the other hand, right, there are many things that sound like these kinds of behaviors that are not criminal at all, such as gambling, such as in certain circumstances, the sale of alcohol, same thing. And so, and never mind transacting between people, but we put people in prison for merely possessing drugs or just marijuana in their own home. And I mean, I could tell you that I represented people where the police go in on a search warrant. They swear to a judge that these are people that have, like an arsenal of weaponry, and drugs and mark money in the house, and they go in there, they find nothing except like a dime bag in somebody's underwear drawer, and everyone gets taken out of the house and arrested and put in jail, right? So those things happen. We so and of course the 20th century is, the civil rights struggle of the 20th century is all about is all about freedom, about what water fountain you can drink from, whether you can go to a municipal swimming pool. And I mean, for God's sake, in 2003, Texas, still Texas and some southern states had laws on the books that prevented you from having consensual sex with someone of the same gender in your own home. That finally changed after Lawrence v. Texas in 2003, the Supreme Court case. So to me, in the legal sense, what does freedom really mean? And for me, it doesn't mean much, because it's so often defined, I think, by powerful interests, often who have a financial interest in the outcome of what we consider to be freedom or a crime. I mean, there's a reason why alcohol is not a crime, for example, and drugs are a crime, or marijuana specifically, without really going down a rabbit hole.
Well, actually, do you think you could say something I mean, because there's a question I wanted to ask you before, and I don't know if I wanted to wait until later, but um, you know, you're expressing a certain degree of cynicism when you say that freedom in a legal sense doesn't have a lot of value because in many ways that it's abused by the criminal justice system, the legal system more broadly. Um, what's the justification, though, that is given for the denial of freedom for the drug purchases that you were talking about, and some of the sexual cases? You know, I've always been impressed by the line. It doesn't matter if you lie to me. As long as it's your lie. I want, you're telling me about yourself. I mean, what is the justification given?
Well, I'm going to answer that in a moment, but what I'm trying to make clear here is not is that we have this concept of freedom, and the reason why at the beginning, before we got on the air, that my picture, my video was pixelating, was because I put up a background, and I put up a background of an eagle flying in the sky with a flag behind it that says, live free or die, or something along those lines, right? And my point in bringing this up, and I will get to answer your question, because I am somewhat of a communitarian persuasion for a constitutional lawyer, what I mean is that I don't think we should have drug laws in the way that we do it. I'm probably not as outraged by them as the average libertarian, civil libertarian who does the kind of work that I do. I'm kind of willing to live with a little, restrictions like that, because I think we try to muddle through. But to answer your direct case, your direct question, I think, well, it's what our parents told us about drugs and sex and all of that. It's about morals, right? And I think that's the other part of this. I mean, I think, and that was what I was just about to say, is that I think sometimes it's driven by powerful financial interests, and sometimes it's driven by majoritarian views of religious morality, organized religion, instead of philosophy and rationality, and even spiritualism, in a sense, that's personal. And I think that's what drives that. And really, my point is not to say how horrible that is, because I think on balance it's not good. But I'm not, as I said, a hand waving libertarian that way. But I think what it does, though, is expose the ridiculousness of the conception that we have of ourselves as lovers of freedom, because we don't. That's not what this is at all. Because if we were, the people who are in Michigan Capitol today holding, submachine guns or whatever the hell they had, semi-automatics, would be on the front lines also saying, how can we keep marijuana illegal, right? But we have a group of people, and it's not just them. I mean, it's plenty of people in the political mainstream who sort of use these conceptions of American freedom to prevent people from doing things that, by any sort of rational analysis, they ought to be able to do under our under our system of government. And so that's really, I think, the point. And I really do. So I appreciate the question, but that's what I'm trying to drive at here. So I just want to talk for a moment, and then I'm going to move, and then I'm going to be done. So to kind of get back, I'm just sort of looking on and off the little script I have here. So when I think about freedom, I don't think about, as I was just saying, eagles and stars and stripes, or really anything to do with our country's culture or its institutions. What I think about are prisoners, and the prisoners that I meet. I meet a lot of prisoners. I've met with hundreds of prisoners in visiting rooms in upstate prisons, over the last 10 to 15 years. Many are doing really long sentences. And yet many of them find some freedom in, under the circumstances that they're living in. I think that out here we take our freedom for granted. We talk about it in nonsensical terms. We talk about it as a form of patriotism, not as a reality. And almost none of these guys, and it's almost always men, have graduated high school, and yet I could tell you that I've just sat there, and off the top of his head, a prisoner once recited like a 7 or 8 minute passage to me from Macbeth, just because that's what he wanted to talk about. I mean, I know prisoners who've written books, I know prisoners who study psychology, who study social work when they know that they're never going to get out. And that's not everybody. There's some prisoners who are not doing well in that environment, for sure. But many are, more than 50% from my view. So when I think about freedom, I don't think of eagles, I think of them. And I think about how the little thread of freedom that they have is so important to them, and they use it. And so I think the other thing I think about when I think about freedom, and I hate to bring this name up around a real philosopher, but I'm going to, is Sartre. And I read Sartre in college, and the one thing I really stuck with me was that he felt most free, he said, when he was in a Vichy prison camp. He was, he was a resistor in France against the Nazis. And he said, because his experience of freedom was so visceral that it had more freedom. Like, no matter what they could do to you, you still had the freedom to say no. And for him, at that moment, it felt like everything. And so when I think about freedom, I don't think about the law, and I don't think about, the red, white, and blue. I think about Sartre, and I think about the prisoners I meet, and I think about myself. And I wonder, even though I'm not in prison, am I allowing myself to really be free and live a free life? So that's the lawyer's conception of freedom, which, of course, as usual, is cynical. But it's cynical in the legal sense. But I look forward to hear what you guys have to say, because I think you'll have more important things to say about it.
Thank you very much, Leo. A lot there, which I think we'll be returning to. Jane?
I feel like I went on too long. I'm sorry.
There's a lot in there. Definitely that interconnectedness, considering what we talked about the first time between the idea of your liberties and your freedoms. These are abstract nouns that we have to fill in the blanks of what constitutes them. And we live in this punitive society. And that's what you're really talking about. It's like the tragedy that we have a punitive society instead of letting the consequences of people's actions be, they're not punishments, they're the way reality will unfold for them because of certain decisions that they made. Prison really should be for protecting, it shouldn't be for punishment, it should be for protecting the public from people who will hurt them, who will infringe on their liberties. And the same things with like sex, drugs, rock and roll, those things are, they should be up to us. And as long as the people aren't really hurting each other and ruining the world for each other, why aren't the consequences of their decisions enough for them to live in? Why do we have to have this other voice? And it's like, this is about will. The strongest thing we have is our will to live. And our will to live, our will to survive, demands that we find freedom. If we don't find it, we can't live. And that's why it's a mental state. It's actually not something someone can give to us.
Right.
And that's why those prisoners can talk to you about Macbeth and study social work and do their lives, because you cannot, like Bob Marley says in Redemption Song.
Oh my God, I was just thinking that.
Totally, right? Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Have no fear for atomic energy, because none of them can stop the time. How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? Oh, some say it's just a part of it. We've got to fulfill the book. I mean, come on, Bob Marley. We all know that song, right? It's like, and it's because it speaks to that. Freedom is a state of mind. You know, and it has to be, because it feeds our will to live. And yeah, so I really appreciate all those points, and thinking, I really love talking to lawyers, because it's the practical, tangible aspect of poetics. And I actually think poetry and philosophy are actually the same. You know what I mean? Like, they're very, like, super related. Just poems are a lot shorter than philosophical dissertations. But
Well, I agree with you. You know, Plato talked about the kind of the war between philosophy and poetry. I'm much more with Nietzsche. You know, the
yes,
poets and the philosophers, they're actually working the same side of the street.
absolutely.
And Joe, by the way, I just want to tell you, I hear that from women all the time. They love to talk to lawyers. So
Yeah.
anyway,
I'm sure.
yeah, all the time. Anyway.
So there's a poem I want to recite that actually is my new single for my new record. It's just a coincidence. I didn't even really know freedom was going to be the topic, because then it got switched. But this poem, it's like, it's not just punishments from our government that can imprison us, but just our own circumstances, our own bodies, our own health. You know, it's like, we have to figure out a way out of it. How do we do it? And there was this poem, Invictus, by William Ernest Henley. It's a really famous poem that was recited by prisoners and soldiers alike. And it was a really popular poem in the trenches of World War I. That was like the most gruesome war, arguably. Mm-hmm. That would give them the strength to carry on. We have to create our freedom. No one's going to give it to us. You know, it's like, we have to make it. And it's like one of the magic things of our imaginations. The thing that humans are capable of is making freedom in the most restrictive circumstances. Which also, another thing I wanted to talk about was, there's this very poetic playwright, Richard Foreman, who, when he directs his plays, he even directs the eye motions of the characters. He directs where their fingers will be. So it's like, it's very poetic, and I guess it's really choreography in absolute movement of each aspect of the character, like where their elbow will be, which way they'll look, which way their eyes will look. And it sounds really restrictive, right? But when you hear interviews of people who act in his plays, they all have this one thing in common, where they say, the most free they ever feel is acting in one of his plays. When he is actually directing every aspect of their movement and the language that comes out of their mouth, there's something in that restriction. And it is the same thing like the BDSM scene. Those ropes, bondage is how things are always the opposite. Sometimes in restriction, we really can find the most freedom. And it's because it's what it forces us to access mentally. And for poetry, for example, it's such a free form of writing, but it's also the most restrictive. If you work in any traditional form, it's very restrictive. And those kind of restrictions actually free some people up more. As a teacher, if I tell kids, write whatever you want, a bunch of the kids will have a lot of ideas, but then there's a lot of kids that is not helpful. If I say, I want you to write something with 3 colors, 17 nouns, and 4 verbs, they're like, they have a starting place, and that seems restrictive to someone else. So it's not like this one formula that can make you, this is free, this is not free. It's up to you. It really comes from inside you, and it's one of our powers as humans to make for ourselves. So here's Invictus by William Ernest Henley. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head lies bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Chills. So good. Yeah, so he's nailing it. Like you could, no matter what the thing is. So it's this thing that comes from inside of us.
You're
Yeah,
using
so
that. You're using that in a song.
yeah, actually, it's called Invictus, and it's on Spotify and Apple and everything by my band, The Icebergs. I treat it like I turn it into a song, and I like repeat one part, and then I actually added in a bridge, and the words that I added are your days are numbered, so make them count. You are atoms from what's around. What you eat and what you make, how you live and how you play, what you love and what you hate, what you think and what you take. Those are the things that make us, make our freedoms. Those are our decisions of how, what are our parameters for our lives? What are we gonna react to? What are we gonna incorporate? It's what we take. It's our own reactions to things. You know, we're each limited in different ways. We each have access to different money, access to different abilities because of our physical selves. You know, a woman's freedom is different than a man's freedom. It's your culture totally impacts your freedom in someone else's eyes, in how they treat you, and then you have your own life. No one knows what's inside your heart, or no one can it's like the immeasurable, you know. So that is that's some freedom for you.
Thank you. I guess it's my turn.
Yes.
Um, I actually, as I kind of like said before, there's something I kind of, in some ways, I'm kind of puzzled by freedom, and so I want to, I guess, raise some questions, get your thoughts on it, and definitely there were things both of you said which um, bear on what I've been wondering about as I've been thinking about this, and um, I think one thing to say is to pick up, I guess, something from what I said last week when we were talking about. Leo had mentioned the social contract, and he mentioned Rousseau, and as I said, you have him saying, man is born free, yet everywhere is in chains, and as I said, talking about the point about interconnectedness, it's actually he's born dependent. So like our kind of almost natural condition is not free. It is dependent on one another, and I tried to say how I think how important that is for the development of one's identity, who one is, and throughout one's life. First from being born and reaching maturity, but still this interconnectedness through emotional interdependence and relationships. And it got me thinking about like how significant freedom is. If freedom, in some sense, and there's kind of multiple ways in which we think about freedom and employ the concept or family of concepts of freedom, but to what extent freedom kind of is this pair, it's almost interdependent with interdependence. So we are dependent on each other. And so there are the norms that govern these relationships and the expectations that are cultivated and developed, and the horizons of meaning which are established through these relationships. How much of freedom, the drive for freedom, is a resistance to that? Is in some ways we wanted to pull away from that, to not be uh, in the spotlight of the normative gaze in the sense of another, and you can extend this into the political realm. The wanting to be free of the strictures as much as possible of law, of social mores, of government interference. I mean, normativity has much to do with governance, the governance of our actions, of our thoughts, and I wonder how what this impulse for freedom is, this drive for freedom. Is it a kind of a recoiling from something very fundamental about the human condition? The human condition is a normative condition. We our existence is overlaid with meaning and with a sense of significance, a sense of self-reflection, about whether or not we are measuring up to certain standards, some of our own, those others are feel are imposing on this. How much of it is kind of a resistance to something very fundamental about being human? And um, I'm I was wondering how much of what you were saying before could bear on this, both of you. And maybe it would be helpful to bring in a little bit of philosophical terminology. Philosophers often distinguish between what's called positive liberty and negative liberty, or positive freedom and negative freedom. So, to the point, Leo, about a terminological distinction, we can draw terminological distinctions, but kind of as a for the most part, most social, political philosophers who talk about this actually do use them somewhat interchangeably, um, which is not to say that it isn't useful to kind of have more confined definitions. But broadly speaking, the idea of negative liberty or negative freedom is being free from external coercion or constraint. So just as long as there are no obstacles for me to do what I want to do, um, I'm free. And but there's another conception of liberty, something called positive liberty, which is more about kind of this kind of understanding of the self, being kind of the self being kind of having internal obstacles removed from the possibility of self-realization, self-actualization, achieving my true self, um, and um, some philosophers find this more positive conception potentially troubling because it actually can lead to ideas of tyranny. Um, on a political scale, if you have a society or a government that says, "Look, we know what will help you achieve your true selves. We know better than you," and paternalism, tyranny of various sorts of like, we will coerce you into achieving your true freedom. Um, and you can also have an individualized tyranny of the self because you have this idea of like, I must order my passions, my desires, my attitudes in such a way that they are correctly aligned so I find out my true self. I don't find this idea of a true self appealing. I don't think there is one, but echoing, I think, something Jane was saying, I believe, referencing Marley, was that if there is any sort of a true self, it's only something that one could only find oneself. No one else can impose that freedom on you or help you actualize yourself. So it's negative freedom, which I find, more tractable. And so, to what extent is this kind of desire to remove obstacles, and to, you know, for what purpose? What is the use of it? And I don't. I'm not. That's not a cynical question, but really a question of let's try to get at this. What is this freedom and why? And both of you have kind of touched on it, I think, in different ways. I mean, trying to, it is
I
somewhat
think
about
the
actualism.
question, it's the question, what is the freedom? Because just like you're saying, we'll reach for different things. Like tyranny, there is something comforting to a lot of people about a dictatorship, and they want that. Think of religion. We people flock toward religion because religion helps them remove the obstacles within themselves. It's like, what are our inner obstacles that we're trying to overcome? What are our good parts or our bad parts? We are filled with these conflicting desires. That's the hallmark of humanity. And religion and this concept of freedom or tyranny in government or punishment, all of those kind of restraints that we put on ourselves ultimately are to remove our inner obstacles so we don't have to, if this thing is illegal or if I'm not allowed to do this, then that's an easy thing for me to follow. We're always kind of looking for these rules, and it's in rules where we feel comforted. And that's why there are people that really do want the dictatorship and would rather participate in a dictatorship because ultimately it's easier. Someone's just telling you what to do. It's not sitting around in a democratic way, literally fighting it out and figuring out what you're going to do together, and that there's not like just one absolute. And that's the freedom, is the fight to define what freedom is the fight to define the obstacles and decide how we're going to move them around in our lives or interact with them.
And if I could just add on to that, Joe, or did you want to answer that first, or
No, I was just wondering. I was wondering if your friend here was going to be commenting on this.
Yeah, Maldini is brilliant, but he can't talk, so that's the problem. But we, I did, and you're talking about, the concept of true self, just doesn't do it for you. And I think I know where you're coming from. At least in part, you were talking last week about how we're always in the state of becoming. We're always so. You're whatever you are, you're just that thing for some split second, right? And we're always becoming and evolving, and that involves change. And I'm wondering if that's what you're thinking about. But really, putting aside the question of true self, I mean, do you believe in some sort of concept of authentic self? Like, I mean, do you think that's a concept worth exploring, as an individual? Because to me, that's very connected to freedom, right?
Yes, yes, I do. And about it would be about kind of self being kind of a self-reflected endorsement in a sense of one's identity, how one is acting. Um, I I think I would find content in the idea of authenticity there.
Well, because I think, um, I don't think on you guys level, I have to sort of, think about how we live and how people seem to, interact and state their beliefs in our society. But, I, that's part of what I was hoping to get at. Though, talking with you guys helps me crystallize what I sort of prepared prior to, which is the best thing about this. If nobody watches, you guys have helped me sort of crystallize my thoughts. But you know, I think a lot of what when we talk about freedom and we have thoughts about freedom, I think a lot of it is junk. I think freedom is something. If we could talk about it at all, it's something about you know recognizing and nurturing and sort of plumbing for your authentic self. And I fight with libertarians a lot. That's one of the things that I do for fun. And they, and they, and I'll talk to somebody about, the right to have an AK-47, whatever that's called. And I'm not getting into the question of gun rights here. It's not really what's important, but it's like people talk about, well, geez, they take that gun away, I'm not free. Well, it's like, I'm like, well, what do you do on Tuesday mornings? Well, I get up and go to work, and I spend 8 hours at a place that actually is not my first choice where I would spend it. And I'm doing things that are not my first choice that I would do, so it just sort of strikes me that, you know, regardless of how you come down on gun rights, it really ought not to be the most important thing in your life in terms of your desire to be free. Your desire to be free ought to be like, you know, you ought to be, why do I have to do these things that I don't really want to do? Which yeah. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. And so yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Well,
Anyone? I'm
well,
sorry, I didn't mean to end the
no,
conversation
no,
there.
no, no. Not at
Well, you know
all.
what it is? It's because guns, because they're so powerful, because really, how I said before about it's so much about the will to live, that guns can literally take away someone's life is empowering. So they feel more empowered. You have more ability to live if you can take away life. And that's one of the things, even like with women's reproductive rights and health, that's so frustrating. Women's bodies do not belong to themselves if we still have to fight every year to have abortion be legal. Why is this even a question? But it's a question. It's been a question for so long. It's so frustrating, and all those things about like accidental pregnancies are always the men's fault. Like, how come people just won't accept that reality? Why do they blame the women when actually it's the men? It's always the men's fault. It's like, but no one will talk about that. But because of gender politics and everything, a woman's freedom is different than a man's freedom. And there's something that does connect with guns in that, because it's about power. And people feel empowered in society by having guns. Just like in a patriarchal society, men are more powerful than women. And it's totally connected to that. So it's like these ideas of what those things represent. And that's what it's like. The guns, it's a metaphor. You know what I mean? It's like that power, like, I want to be able to decide if I can take away someone's life. That's what actually they're always saying. It's like, it's so much bigger than what that one issue is.
And Jane, could you um, go back and I'd love to hear a little bit. You expand on and maybe I missed it because of the ambiance behind me here. Um, but a woman's freedom is different from a man's freedom. Um,
Yeah.
why?
Because men are physically stronger than women. It's that simple. I even just like as you know how you like have different experiences and shows you different things. I really did always consider myself like a completely free person always. And then I had this unique experience in my 20s at this thing that doesn't exist anymore called the Michigan Women's Festival. And it was something I performed at that was this radical space of just women. It was land owned by women and protected by women with guns. And it would have this huge festival of music, and only women were allowed, just women. And when I was part of this women's poetry troupe that got that show there, Sister Spit. And I was like, I don't know. I wasn't that impressed by it. I was one of those girls that didn't feel like I always felt like just a man on my own. Like I didn't even need a dick. My dick is so big I don't even need it on my outside, you know? So that's how I was. And I really operated like that and felt like that. And then when I had this experience of going to this land for real, it was like magical and neat and whatever. And in the middle of the night, I was out in the woods with this totally gorgeous girl, and we were drinking Jack Daniels, and it was so beautiful. And I grew up in the woods and I love the woods, but I was never out in the woods at night. And we were talking about that, and she also grew up in the woods, and she's like, why did we never do this before? Why have we never been in the woods at night? And we realized because we're afraid of being raped, because we're afraid of men. Because what if there's a man in the woods? But other men don't have that fear because they don't have this like constant fear of being attacked and overpowered, and living in a society where the first question is not, what was that guy doing in the woods? It would be, to me, what are you doing in the woods? Like the man has the right to be anywhere he wants in the world because of our society. And that's how women's freedoms are different. And it's like the whole thing of like, that's what privilege is about. It's about, and everyone has different privileges from whatever their body, skin, economic, I mean, all of these different factors come in to making us have the parameters in what we have to exist as. And courts, the same thing always happens with like, you know, boys will be boys when it's white boys, but it's criminals when it's black guys. You know what I mean? Oh, those guys drinking in the woods, boys will be boys. Those white boys drinking in the woods, those black boys drinking in the woods is a threat to society. It's this totally different thing. And that is just why the freedom for women is different. And it does come down to our patriarchal society, and just the fact that even the strongest woman physically is still, just because of physics, can be physically overpowered by men. And just of what we've internalized. I mean, it's our fault because we shouldn't go in the woods. We shouldn't wear this. We shouldn't act like this. And it was after that experience that I actually did feel, I was like, wow, I really am a woman because I won't go into the woods at night alone. And, men I know, and even my brothers had done that. And I would do things with my brothers that I wouldn't do on my own just because they're bigger. But it was, that was in my 20s, and it was like all of that stuff was coming together. And now the Michigan Women's Festival doesn't even exist because times have changed, and now what a woman is different. Back in the 1990s, it really was being born with a vagina, and the whole trans movement just wasn't as big. And then the Michigan Women's Festival ended up collapsing because of trans arguments about who's really a woman. This festival's messed up because a lot of women were like, no, if you ever had a dick, you're not allowed to come. And you know what I mean? So whatever. It only lasted 20 years, but it was like really amazing. And yeah,
Well,
those
thank,
abstract concepts.
thank you. I mean, that raises a number of questions, but I suppose one of them right away is that imbalance of freedom, is that something that can be over addressed, redressed by political means if it is rooted in something as brute as physicality? You know, what can be done? Can it be, dealt with completely, or only in, to a certain extent? Or should
It's,
women be going around with guns?
yeah, like maybe only women should get guns. But it really is, it's comes back down to that thing, like where it really is mental, and the freedom is actually in the conversation, is in the argument, and is always trying to find the edges of it, and to be participating with the plasticity of your mind, with the plasticity of your ideas, that you can like change the way you think about something, and that will give you more freedom or change society. I mean, things do stay the same, but they actually do change. Slowly, our world has changed. And just like how in the 90s, that Michigan Women's Festival meant something different than it started meaning in the whatever the next number is. The noughts,
The Audis or the
the odds.
naughties?
Yeah, exactly. So it's because everything's contextual and everything's always changing. It has to be this living thing. It's not like there's a rubric for what free, it's like it's always going to be changing. And what our freedom is this, is discourse, is the conversation, where we're not making decisions about how things are going to be. It's not this like totalitarian uh, kind of decision thing we're trying to come up with. I mean, that's what does lead to dictatorships, and a lot of people love that. That's what does lead to religion. A lot of people love that, and they find comfort in that. But the whole world is never going to be a dictatorship or a religion, and we're never going to get rid of dictators, and we're never going to get rid of religion. So it's like it's that in between space, and that is freedom. It's that in between conversation where we're trying to pick apart how we want to live and what's important, and that's what freedom is that we're each doing that picking apart thing, putting together our will to live, our participation with our own bodies and our own universes.
Yeah, and I think this really points up the limitations of law here. It is against the law to rape a woman, and yet, and we've had those laws on the books for a long time, and yet someone like Jane LaCroix won't go out into the woods by herself, which of all the people I know is probably the person who could most appreciate it and benefit from doing that than most people. And so we haven't achieved that, right? I mean, so and I do think it's about discourse, as Jane points out, ultimately. And I think that's what, again, what really troubles me, and what I just frankly just think is stupid about our society, is that it's not a worthy topic of conversation whether the Second Amendment gives you a right to carry a firearm or not. I'm not saying that, but when 90% of our discourse as a society is about the right or not right to own a gun, and none of it is about the right of a woman to take a walk in the woods at night, then I'm sorry. I think those are if somehow it flipped and women could feel free to take walks in the woods at night, but we couldn't have guns, we'd have more freedom, not less freedom, as a society. So yeah, I think one of the things we could do is, if we're really serious as a country and as a nation and as a culture about freedom, is to at least start having real conversations about it, and not distracting ones about some extremely small area of life.
Mm-hmm.
On the topic of conversation, I was wondering if either of you might check, or I'll try to check the Facebook feed, because I had another computer set up which I was trying to monitor, and there were some, I could see some things, but then it froze a while ago. So I just wanted to see if there have been any any comments I don't want to ignore. I see one comment here, which I think is spot on. I feel like this conversation needs to happen at 3 a.m., sitting around a table with glasses of bourbon.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, and Maldini chooses not to talk. He practices negative freedom like a pro. Thank you, Scott Reserve. Well, I don't see any other any comments.
Yeah.
But do
No,
you?
I will thank Brady for that comment. And indeed, I can attest to the fact that Brady and her husband Larry are two people who could go toe to toe with bourbon at 3 a.m. and talk philosophy with any of us. So
It is a skill, It's
Mhm.
and an
Well, we're
important
missing
one.
the
I've been there with
symposium
them.
aspect. The symposium had alcohol as part of the
Yes.
definition of what it was.
You
So,
know,
yeah, we should
James.
have, it is cocktail hour. We could have
Yes.
cocktail.
Before we went on the air, I said, Joe, well, Thursday at 5:30, it's vodka and cran o'clock.
Jane, you said something about like the artist and kind of the restraint and constraint
Mhm.
and freedom and that, which reminded me of a passage in Nietzsche from Beyond Good and Evil, which goes right to that. And of course, I can't quite get it. I don't want to, you know, garble it. Try to find the book, but there's I maybe I'll post it kind of in the thread, but Nietzsche speaks to that idea, kind of like the mythic freedom of the artist is
Yes,
misunderstood.
it's a myth.
That it's
Yes.
when the artist is like completely constrained with this vision, with discipline. That's what the kind of the creative process
Totally.
is about. And I
Like,
suppose,
yeah,
and
like Egon Schiele, who is an artist who is imprisoned. He started tearing apart his flesh and painting on the walls with his blood. Like that was his resistance to being imprisoned and his continuation of himself. And he was, someone who did tons of self-portraits, kind of like how Frida Kahlo did. And for the same reason, because he was like his model, because he had all these issues the same way Frida was stuck in a bed with a mirror across from her, like painting from life. If you're stuck in a bed, if you're Egon Schiele and you're stuck in prison, you know what I mean? Like, who's your subject? It's yourself,
this has been wonderful, thoroughly enjoyable again. And I want to, thank you both. I look forward to next week, where will take on the concept of home. And excited. I hope you guys stay well. You have a great night, and the best to both of you.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Leo. You guys are great.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.